to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arlene Sachs, and today my guests are Jim Bartlett and Israel Pickholtz. They have very different backgrounds. They've both done this similar kind of research. Israel's just written a book, Endogamy of Family, Endogamy, one family, one people. And we're going to talk, among other things, that they're both very knowledgeable in DNA, and I'm not, so I will let Jim start by asking Israel something.
Well, Israel and I have been friends on the internet for a while, so we've met recently and got to go over his book about endogamy and DNA and his family tree. So I wanted to ask you, you've worked on your Jewish ancestry for years. How did you get into the DNA part of it?
I am not driven to learn new things. My genealogy database runs on Brothers Keeper for DOS, and my website runs on Netscape 4. So I wasn't looking to get into this new technological field, but I needed it. I had some specific problems that I needed DNA to address. And once I saw, as the first chapter of my book is called, immediate and what's it
Stunning.
called? Immediate and stunning results. I got into other things, and we've been running with it ever since.
Great. So have you found that there's one type of DNA that is better for Jewish research than the other types?
No, I don't think in that sense that Jewish research is different. It's different for other reasons, but not about which type of DNA.
You use the Y-DNA and the mitochondrial?
We use the Y-DNA some, we use the mitochondrial a little, but everybody uses the mitochondrial a little. Nobody uses a lot of mitochondrial. I'm very heavy on the autosomal.
I am too. I like it a lot. Can you give us an example of some dead end that was helped with DNA, and which type of DNA it was?
Well, for a start, we solved the problem of my great-great-grandfather's name. We had no idea what his name was. We knew that my great-grandfather got his name from his mother because Jewish marriages were not always recorded, so the kids got the mother's name. But using DNA, I immediately, at the beginning of the project, quite serendipitously, found my great-great-grandfather's surname.
Was that through the Y-DNA? Or
that was the Y-DNA.
Okay, so
you got absolutely Y-DNA.
So you got two people who matched?
That's right.
And then, so you used the Y-DNA and then the mtDNA. How did you get involved in the autosomal DNA?
Well, there was a group of people that I thought were closely connected, and I realized I could test them and prove that they are second cousins once removed. And that was going to be a simple way to get started in this. And the autosomal DNA proved that I was wrong. They were not a match, and that's okay because no is also an answer.
Okay. So have you been able to prove any lines with DNA?
You can never prove that something is true by DNA. You can prove that things are false. But you can get very close, you can get very supporting, and you can get very, you can come to the conclusions that are pretty far beyond doubt.
So what kind of clues do you learn from, say, autosomal DNA?
Well, who matches whom, and groups of, as you say, triangulated groups, and that tells us that they must have a common ancestor when they have a group of people with the same segments. Again, we have to work on the segments, not the aggregate numbers that the companies throw at us.
As I understand it, the Ashkenazi Jewish, you have a lot of total DNA that you'll get, so that because you have so many cousin relationships.
That's the problem, because the Jews of Europe are related to each other multiple times. All the Jews from Europe are related to all of the other Jews from Europe multiple times, and the DNA can come down from a 6th or 7th or 8th cousin, and when you have a bunch of those, the total numbers will make it look like you're talking about second, third, even fourth cousins when they aren't even close much of the time.
I think we need to explain that because there were so few Jews 500 years ago, that as you get down, as you go back, you get each time more people that are your ancestors. So they've got to be, because you didn't have 10,000 or 100,000.
Not so much that there were few Jews. It's because the Jews that they were deliberately married among themselves. That's why we are all related. If there had been more than however many there were 500 years ago, the same thing would be happening, just at a slightly different pace.
Right. So you use a term called two different kinds of endogamy.
Oh. There are two different kinds of endogamy. Endogamy means marrying within the tribe. There are two different kinds of endogamy. I call them structural and personal. Structural endogamy is what we just said. There were however many Jews there were 500-600 years ago, and it doesn't matter if there were 40,000 or 80,000 or 220,000. But we all had excuse me. Each of us had 1 million ancestors 500-600 years ago, because that's what the arithmetic tells you in 20 generations. So structural endogamy is the fact that you've got X thousands of people providing 1 million ancestors. That's a structural problem, and it creates matches that look much closer than they are. Personal endogamy is my grandparents were cousins. And when you have a lot of that, you get something that works in the completely opposite direction. You have, in fact, fewer cousins because they're all the same ones, counted double. And they're all bringing in the same DNA. This is a different phenomenon, and these two things often work in opposition to one another, and this is good.
Well, I think most Jews do have either first cousin marriages or a niece.
Well,
uncle,
everybody
maybe.
will have 1 or 2 or 3 or 6 or whatever.
And
That far back, or maybe not so far back.
And the way I understand it, it's the way I conceptualize this for myself, it's almost like a column with the same group that started up here. The DNA doesn't go, in general, doesn't go in or out of that column, coming down to the people that are alive today. So the same DNA is down here today that you had when you started out.
That's right. In one quantity or another, it gets
Right.
a little. It doesn't get a little bigger. It gets a little smaller sometimes.
Right.
But you're right. That's the way it works, and you do this very nicely.
Okay.
it's a little bit easier for you if you're not Jewish to
Oh,
find your
it's way
matches.
easier.
Well, I have a number of cousins, 14 cousins in my ancestry back in Colonial Virginia that married each other. So I have some of this, which does complicate it a little bit, but no way that it comes close to the Jewish experience, where you have situations where, how many kits do you manage?
About 90.
90 kits. So you have some people that match half of those and a whole series of them, and they all match each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Trying to
I
sort
have
that
about
out.
90 kits, and about 70 of them are Pickholtz descendants. And about 50 of them are Pickholtz descendants from the one particular town that my family comes from.
Wow.
Now, you talk about the Jewish and the not Jewish. When we have people who have one Jewish and one Jewish, non-Jewish parent, that makes it interesting because we know that all the Jewish DNA came from the same place. Once we rule out that the non-Jewish parent doesn't have any of his own.
Have you traced back to the point where you didn't have a last name? Roughly, or
We
started with that.
Well, I started with. I didn't know my.
Yeah, well,
grandmother.
that was one,
But we
but-
go back with the earliest people that we have. We know their names, and that's why we can't get back any further. I have one great grandparent that I don't know her name,
okay.
but that's a recent thing, and she died young and things like that.
Because there's some books, well, I don't know about Eastern Europe so much, but in Germany there are books that are published when people took their last name. And you can sometimes tell what they were called beforehand.
Germany was a bit more organized at these things than Eastern Europe.
Germany had their last names a little bit sooner, I think,
Yeah.
and France.
And the fancy people. and the fancy people.
Okay, yeah.
The rabbinic families, you know, names like the
they-
Shapiros and the Jaffes and so on.
Yeah, and sometimes they use last names, and then these the books that I've seen will, you know, he was named Cohen, and he took the name Cohen as the last name, but before he was just known as the Cohen.
Oh.
So that made it a little bit makes it a little bit easier.
That gets into the naming patterns, yeah.
Yeah.
So would you say that the endogamy would be the major challenge that you face rather than what I face on this?
No, because we also have the phenomenon of not having surnames before 1800 and not having records before 1800 to
That's
speak
the main
of
one, yeah.
in many places. So we have that challenge and we have that challenge. We have a lot of challenges.
I have a tree.
We also have a lot of challenges because we've lost large numbers of people and because we've lost large numbers of records.
Right. Yeah. I have the fortune of having a tree that goes back into colonial times and before that into the 1600s, and your records in general go back to 1800 or.
That's right. Well, first of all, they weren't keeping records. Napoleon said you got to keep records. But before that, they weren't keeping records in many places. In some places, they were. The other thing is, the worst thing that ever happened to your records was the courthouse burned down.
Yeah.
We had
Lots of that. Lots of
Lots
that.
of other things that happened. Is there something that the DNA told you that eventually came out to be wrong, or led you to a dead end?
Yes. My mother's mother had a half-sister who the last we knew of was a physician in Moscow in 1930 when Stalin closed the borders, and we had no contact with her. Nobody knew whatever happened to her, to Aunt Mera, who we knew her last name was Golden. We didn't know anything else about her. Some months ago, last year, a year and a half ago, a friend of mine found her grave in Moscow, and it said Mera Davidovna Golden, and she was buried with her husband, Davidovna being her patronymic. So this is her father. Days after that, I got a second to fourth cousin DNA match with a man named David Golden. And I said, this is Aunt Mera's son or grandson. This is my mother's half first cousin or my half second cousin. And when I inquired his kit manager, who said he tested for me because I promised that nobody would bother him, he said that this man was born in America. His father was born in America in 1910, so he could not be any descendant of Aunt Mera, who was born in 1903. On the other hand, David Golden matches over 40 of the 50 Pickholtz descendants from Skalat. I don't know why. That's one of my challenges.
Well, it must have been
I
true.
discuss him in chapter 9 of my book.
That's the Jewish DNA. Yeah.
That's what I've got a whole list of people, many of whom prominent in the Jewish genealogy field, who match 40 of my 50 people from my particular town who are all Pickholtz descendants. And the matches with these people will be from beforehand. From our common ancestor will be 1750, 1720, 1690. When we don't have surnames, they don't have surnames. We don't know the geography. There are no records. Most of them are not in the same area where my people were in 1800, but I don't know where my people were in 1720.
Yeah, you got to.
This sort of illustrates the different objectives that different people have. In my case, the objective is to work on all of my ancestors, and that has its own problems for me. But in your case, you started out and have continued with the focus with the Pickholtz family.
That's right. That has been my flagship project for the last 18 years.
Yeah. So you're not as much focused on the other lines, but they play into this. As you go down, you find other people that...
My DNA research is different from other people's DNA because most people are doing DNA to find their relatives. And I'm speaking of not adoptive and so on, but just regular people are doing their DNA to find their relatives, I'm not doing that. I'm taking a defined group of Pickholtz descendants and trying to see how they fit together. It's what we call a single surname project.
Right. And that's largely what this book is about.
That's right.
Is chapter by chapter, absolutely fascinating stories about each section of this as you find some group of DNA that matches because you are focused on those particular family lines.
Well, I tried to set this up as success after success, one chapter after another, and then after, when I got up to about chapter 10, I started going into a bit more of the theory and so on, and that's the way I wanted to set it up.
And you even do some triangulation.
I did triangulation. I quoted you several times. I quoted you changing your mind over a period of 6 weeks several times in order to say, this is a new field. We are learning it. The opinions are changing. We can look back even 3-4 years ago and look at the things that some of us said then and realize that they were pretty silly.
Would one of you please explain triangulation? I know you both know what it's about. Explain it to those on TV,
I'll take it on.
that don't know.
Triangulation is a situation where 3 people match each other. So you take somebody that matches, typically I match 2 people, A and B, on the same segment, on the same area of a chromosome. So if I match A and I match B on the same segment, they could both be from my mother's side, my father's side, or one could be mother's side and one could be father's side. But if they match each other on that same segment, they have to be on the same side. Okay, it just works out. That's what triangulation is. If we all 3 match on the same segment, then it comes from one ancestral line. Okay.
With Jewish DNA, we have to be more careful because even if all 3 match, they might not be from the same ancestor because one may be getting it around the other way from someplace else. So we have to be very, very careful when we're doing this with Jewish DNA. You can't be automatic.
Right. And this is one of the things that Israel and I have been talking about is this in general, or is it, I believe that it's specifically if you get down to one segment, that can only come from one ancestor. And you know, we've talked about this several times, and everyone is correct in that this is an evolving frontier that we're on. Genetic genealogy, as it applies to autosomal DNA, only started in 2010.
Exactly.
We're only 6 years old. And quite literally, we are inventing the rules as we go along.
Maybe we should explain what the difference is between the Y chromosome follows the male line, the mitochondria follows the female line. It's not very valuable at all. And the autosomal, you can cross back and forth between the male and the female.
Let me correct you. It is very valuable because if you're looking to see if 2 people come from the same place
mother
and they don't match,
Right.
then it is an unquestionably proven fact.
Yep. If they don't match.
If it's the female line.
And I have used that
male.
to demonstrate several very critical points.
But the autosomal DNA, you get half of it from each parent, and they got it from their parents, and they got it from their parents. So the autosomal DNA, you basically get it from all of your ancestors, going back quite a ways. The companies will tell you it goes back to 5th cousins or something like that. In my experience, it can go back 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th cousins, but our genealogies tend to run out. And with Jewish genealogies, they tend to run out even earlier than that, which makes it harder in those cases. But you are basically getting, with autosomal DNA, clues about all of your ancestors. And it has to be emphasized over and over again that the DNA is a tool, and you use it along with your genealogy. None of the DNA can tell you who your ancestor is. As Israel has pointed out, some of the tests will tell you things that are factually not true, okay, and you can rule them out. But you have to have genealogy and work with it on these tools.
This is not magic.
It is not magic.
It is not magic. Sometimes you get lucky, but most of the time it's simply hard work. There's some luck involved in having the people to match, and having the families available, and having families that don't have just one child. But this is hard work.
So along that line, and closer to home here in Fairfax County, Virginia, I understand that you and Arlene have been tested and have some matches.
Arlene got a match. Arlene's results came in, and she has 2 matches who are listed as second to third cousins, and one of them is a third cousin of mine who lives in Baltimore, and the other is his nephew. And none of the surnames that Arlene has on her list match my cousins, but my cousin's father died when he was very young, and he doesn't know anything about his family on that side. It's not on my side, apparently. But you don't have enough people to test at this point to try to see how they fit together. But they're right there. They show up as second to third cousins, which they aren't. But they could be not much further than that.
That's what's the total.
They could be close enough that this is doable
If he found out his father.
if your ancestors had had a few more children.
That's one of the tricks to the trade here with autosomal DNA, is getting as many close cousins as you can to test, because they give you important clues. If it's a close cousin on your mother's side or your father's side, you can narrow down which path you're on, and that helps you with your genealogy part of this equation. You know specifically where to look.
That's right. And you can't say, Josh already tested, I don't have to. You can't say, I have a fellow who says, oh, I know who I am, my third cousin already tested, what do you mean? They're all different. Siblings are different. It makes a big difference. You get as many as you can, as many as who will agree, as many as your budget can handle. And you can't answer the question in advance, why do I need this? Because you don't know. When you get it, you'll find out. Or 5 years from now, you'll find out.
I think you should say that the reason that siblings are not necessarily the same is because one could have gotten more from the mother and the other more from the father, and therefore, that's why they don't show.
No, because everybody gets 50% from each parent.
50%,
but for a specific match.
Grandparents.
For a specific match that you would have, one of the siblings might have none of that match, and this one.
Exactly.
So when you have several siblings involved, you'll have a situation where one might match, both might match, or the other one might match. And there will be some people, if you had your parent tested, that the parent will match and neither of the children, none of the children match.
I have a fourth cousin for whom I and one of my sisters have no match at all, and my other 3 sisters have matches of between 30 and 68 centimorgans, which is huge. And the average third cousin's only 50.
Oh, wow.
Or 53. They have individual segments with more than 60, and I and my younger sister don't match this cousin at all. Yeah. If we had only tested us, say, 2 is enough. 2 is not enough.
I
can't tell you why. Find out when it happens.
Well, you said centimorgan.
Centimorgans is the way we measure DNA. Nobody knows what it really means.
So if you have a chromosome with all your DNA, it's just a yardstick way of measuring the different segments.
Okay, so
it's unique to this field. Yeah.
Every time you turn around, there's more vocabulary, and it's pretty hard sometimes to keep up with.
Quite frankly, we're making some of it up as we go.
Yeah.
Quite frankly, it's not in the literature. It's not. The scientists haven't been working on genealogy. So for things that we do for genealogy, we have to make up some terms that...
the spell checker underlines endogamy.
Yes,
the spell checker doesn't recognize the word endogamy.
Right.
Well, that's...
So do you have a favorite story? We have a few minutes left.
Well, this is why I started doing DNA. I'm going about my business, and I get a note from a woman in Poland, Polish woman, sends me an email and says, my mother said that my grandfather was the son of a Polish servant girl and an older man named Pickholtz, to whom she was not married, who was the estate manager in a particular town. Can I help her? Can I find her family, verify the story? And I said, well, I know who the estate manager is. I'm friends with his great-grandson. We did some testing. We got her uncle to test. And not only, they would have been second cousins, half-second cousins. DNA can do half-second cousins. But since there was no other way for them to be related, even if DNA had said they were third or fourth cousins, this proves it's right. But besides that, we had no other Y DNA in this line except this woman. this woman's uncles.
Uncle.
And we were able to determine his Y DNA that we had no other way to get to from this Polish woman.
And so then you had the other Y DNA from you?
Then I was able, I couldn't come do it to me because I didn't know who my great-grandfather, what great-great-grandfather was. But yes, that's the way we did it. And that's when I got some immediate and stunning results. And that led me to go do other things, some of which worked and some of which didn't work. Yeah. But that's what got me into this.
When you look for matches, do you sit and scroll through the screen to try to find your these matches, or do you have some kind of a program?
I wish I had the patience to scroll through. What mostly happens is that the Family Tree DNA, where we do our testing, where our family does our testing, will send you notices that people have close matches. I will open the person's website. I will look at I will sort by latest matches and look at the latest matches and see who's there.
Okay.
Yeah. The report, when you test with the company,
Which is how we found you.
Yeah, they give you a list of all the matches, and then your name came up on Israel's list.
Well, I had 8,000 matches. And so far, anybody that's contacted me, there's just no similarity of names that I can find. Or
You want it to be easy. It is not easy.
Well, the first names you generally have some pattern with the name pattern. We've got just a few seconds left of there. Anything else that you want to add? 20
I'm
seconds.
having a good time.
What else can we add? We are having a wonderful good time. Jim and I were obviously in some previous life either related or neighbors or something. What else can I tell you?
Okay.
We're having a good time.
Thank you very much for coming on the show. I hope people got something out of it. It's a really hard topic to get your head around, and unless you do an awful lot of research in it, you sort of get lost and overwhelmed by listening to it.
Until you start, you get nothing.
That's right.